Welcome to Washington Today for March 10th, 2025. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thank you for joining us. We are less than 5 days away from a potential government shutdown. The House Rules Committee is meeting this afternoon to set up floor debate for a bill that will fund the federal government until September 30th. That bill is expected to hit the House floor tomorrow, but passage is not a sure thing. One House Republican says he will be voting no, while several others are undecided. House Democratic leaders say they'll be sticking together to vote no. We'll tell you the latest coming up. Markets continued their sell-off today. MarketWatch.com reporting that the Nasdaq recorded its worst day since 2020, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell almost 900 points amid fears of a recession. Meanwhile, President Trump says the tariffs he imposed and then adjusted on Mexico and Canada are part of his long-term economic strategy, while Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has dismissed fears of a recession, and Canada has chosen its new leader. His name is Mark Carney, and fighting back against those tariffs were a big part of his victory speech last night. The former head of the country's central bank won more than 85% of the vote by Liberal Party members. He also told supporters that, quote, America is not Canada, and Canada will never, ever be part of America in any way, shape, or form. We'll hear what he had to say about the tariffs coming up. The Rules Committee gavelled in at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Here's Ranking Member Jim McGovern.
You know, we stand just 4 days away from a government shutdown. So let's be crystal clear about who's running the show here, because some of my Republican colleagues seem confused. Republicans run the House. Republicans run the Senate. And the White House is a Republican-run circus led by Elon Musk and Donald Trump. You guys talk about winning by a landslide. You talk about having a mandate. Well, that makes this very simple. If the government shuts down, there is no mystery about who's to blame. No excuses, no spin. It will be because Republican dysfunction and Republican extremism got in the way. And if we are being really honest here, Republicans have been trying to shut the government down since Trump took over. Trump's Office of Management and Budget tried to do that last month by unilaterally freezing all federal spending. When the American people pushed back, Republicans realized they had shut it down. Republicans realized they had to shut it down more covertly. That's when Trump gave Elon Musk and Doge unprecedented power to sabotage the federal government, letting them hack into agencies and dismiss thousands of critical federal workers. And now it seems like you all just want to shut the government down the old-fashioned way, by not doing your job and failing to fully fund it. The continuing resolution in front of us today is just more of the same. You're trying to gut programs people rely on so you can give more handouts to billionaires. I mean, this CR goes after support for our veterans. We know veterans have been fired through Doge's purges, and we know that Republicans want to fire some 80,000 people who help take care of veterans. Now Republicans are using this CR to gut funds for veterans exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic substances. Another big middle finger to veterans. Republicans have already fired Social Security Administration workers. This CR would make it easier to fire more of them, meaning that when seniors call for help with their Social Security check, they're going to have to wait even longer to get a real person on the other end to help them out. And I can't believe it, but this bill defunds police. This bill takes away from law enforcement, firefighters, and EMTs in D.C. Wild, coming from the party that couldn't resist meddling in D.C.'s local laws last Congress under the guise of concern for public safety and homelessness in the city. You know, the way Republicans treat the district is not only disrespectful, it's just plain rotten, and we'll be talking more about that later on. Some of the things in this bill are just so stupid and irresponsible. Giving Trump the tools to dismantle NOAA right before we head into another hurricane season. I mean, that's really smart.
One of the committee's first witnesses, Appropriations Chair Tom Cole.
I appear before you today on the full-year Continuing Appropriations and Extensions Act for 2025. Today's measure presents a stark choice for members of this body. Before us are two roads, one that leads to a government shutdown and another better road that keeps the government open and operating. As we move toward a vote on the House floor on this bill, Members must ask themselves which road they wish to take. Do they want to vote to keep the government open and operating for their constituents, or do they want to affirmatively vote to shut the government down? This is the choice which faces us today. Over the past year, the Appropriations Committee has worked diligently to complete our work on fiscal year 2025. We initially had a late start due to prior constraints, but that didn't stop us from taking quick action. Our markup process successfully delivered all 12 regular appropriations bills out of committee in a timely fashion. And before the end of the summer, this chamber passed 5 bills across the floor representing nearly 71% of all overall discretionary spending. Since our last funding extension, we've worked diligently to reach a bipartisan and bicameral deal on full year spending bills for FY25. Unfortunately, although we were close on the numbers, the minority has made additional demands on the legitimate exercise of executive authority in the appropriations process. These are demands that the minority would never accept for a Democratic president, nor are they provisions that President Trump would or should ever sign into law. This brings us to today. Despite our best efforts and despite the fact that Republicans never walked away from the negotiating table, we're now out of time. The House must move forward with a year-long continuing resolution. This outcome is not one that I wanted. However painful as it is, it's better than the alternative, which is a government shutdown. Congress has an obligation to our constituents and to the nation to keep the government open and operating. With today's measure, we achieve just that. Today's bill will fund the government through September 30th, the end of fiscal year 2025. It maintains the status quo, providing flat funding for the government and including only legitimate anomalies. We've accomplished these goals while also increasing money for the Department of Defense, fully funding the single largest pay raise for junior enlisted personnel in over 40 years. Importantly, today's bill also does not contain a single poison pill rider. It's a clean CR, fully funding our government.
Emily Brooks from the Hill quoting that Speaker Johnson is confident the continuing resolution will pass, quote, because no one wants to shut the government down. And we are governing, doing the responsible thing as Republicans. It's going to be up to Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats to do the right thing. But already, Speaker Johnson has lost one vote. That's Kentucky Republican Thomas Massie. He said he'll vote against the bill. And Politico is reporting that Republicans on the fence include Corey Mills of Florida, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Tony Gonzalez of Texas, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. They join, or could potentially join, all House Democrats standing together against the bill. Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, Minority Whip Catherine Clark, and Caucus Chair Pete Aguilar released a letter on Saturday saying, quote, the partisan House Republican funding bill recklessly cuts health care, nutritional assistance, and $23 billion in veterans benefits. Equally troublesome, the legislation does nothing to protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid while exposing the American people to further pain throughout this fiscal year. We are voting no. Here's House Budget Ranking Member Brendan Boyle yesterday on MSNBC.
Well, first, just to set the stage for this, I want to make it clear that Republicans control the House, Republicans control the Senate, and they, of course, control the White House. If there is a government shutdown, it will be because Republicans want one. That's number one. Number two, we are already in a government shutdown, or at least a partial government shutdown. That's the case of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's the case at USAID. That's the case for researchers right here in Philadelphia who have been relying on NIH grants in order to research cancer. All of that has immediately dried up thanks to the illegal actions of this administration led by Elon Musk. So my position is exactly the same as Leader Jeffries and my colleague Rosa DeLauro and my other Democratic colleagues. We want to fix all of this, but certainly if we don't believe that we have a willing partner on the other side, and it's quite clear right now we don't, then we need to stay united and not bail out President Trump and Speaker Johnson.
Now, one of the concerns among Democrats is that this bill will cut benefits in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. House Republican aides have told the Washington Post that the cuts will not touch those programs, will not touch Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. Do you believe them?
Well, and rather than trying to take their word for it, I would rather look at their record. Literally, Jonathan, just a week and a half ago, every House Republican except for Thomas Massie voted to cut Medicaid by $880 billion. This past week, at my direction and request, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office confirmed that these would be hundreds of billions of dollars worth the Medicaid, the largest in American history. So we already know that they are for Medicaid cuts because they've already done it.
And here's Bloomberg News congressional reporter Eric Wasson speaking earlier today on Washington Journal. He talked about the stakes for House Republicans and possible Democratic support for the continuing resolution once it makes it to the Senate.
I just think the House Republicans want to demonstrate that they can muscle this through because that gives them leverage. For years, they've had to say, we have to strike a bipartisan deal with Democrats. We can't get it on our own. We have rebels in our own caucus. If they can get this through the House, then they have more leverage in talks going forward.
Okay, so come back to the Senate. Who would be the 7 or 8 Democrats who would be most likely to support something like this, or at least be targeted by Republicans to try to put a pressure campaign to pass something once it goes through the House?
Well, we can almost guarantee that John Fetterman will vote for this no matter what. He came out on X, formerly known as Twitter, saying, he's not going to oppose a CR. You have people like John Ossoff who are, in Georgia up for re-election in 2026, very vulnerable, perhaps the most vulnerable Senate Democrat. People like Jeanne Shaheen also, if she's running for re-election, which is not yet clear, in New Hampshire, it could be among them that we see these 7 votes.
And we heard Representative McGovern talk about the continuing resolution's possible impact on D.C. city government. The Washington Post reporting today that D.C. officials say it could potentially lead to about $1 billion in overnight cuts should it pass. Those could impact everything from the city's law enforcement to schools. Well, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser talked about it today with reporters outside the Capitol.
Here is why we're here today, because Congress can fix this. They can fix this $1.1 billion problem that we have brought to their attention in the draft CR. The Congress can add the language back to the continuing resolution, the same language that's been there for the past 2 continuing resolutions that authorize us to spend our locally generated revenue according to our own approved budget and timeline. And I want to emphasize the local part of that statement. The District of Columbia raises and spends its own money, just like every other state. So remember that the budget we're talking about, this budget, the approved FY25 budget, was introduced by me and approved by this council. It focuses on 3 main areas: public safety, public education, and economic growth. Disrupting those investments won't be good for D.C. or our country. And this is not just about us. Certainly, we are concerned about the 700,000 tax-paying Americans that call D.C. home. But it's also about our nation's capital. And so I want Americans across the country to know that we are proud of our city. We are a growing city. In fact, if we were a state last year, we would have been the fastest improving state in the nation. We balanced our budgets. We have 28 balanced budgets. We have increased visitation. Americans from around the country and people from around the world broke a record last year, and we have driven down violent crime to the lowest levels in 30 years. And actually, this is a good time to visit the district because soon we'll have beautiful cherry blossoms as well. This action, let me be clear, if the Congress goes through with this action, it will work against a priority that President Trump and I share, and that is to make Washington, D.C. the best, most beautiful city in the world. And we want to work with our partners in the federal government to ensure that D.C. always represents the strength and prosperity of this country.
According to Politico, the House bill would add billions of dollars for deportations and immigration enforcement. And that was on the mind of Vice President J.D. Vance, who spoke at the National League of Cities annual meeting here in Washington, D.C.
Now, I'll say this, it's actually not just an American problem either. If you go to Canada, where because of their laws and regulations, they've seen a massive increase in the number of people who have come into their country. You go to the United Kingdom, you go across the world, and you see a very consistent relationship between a massive increase in immigration and a massive increase in housing prices. And we have to be honest about that. Well, I see one of our nice representatives out here wants to actually, I guess, continue to flood the country with illegal immigrants, making your communities and citizens unaffordable. But, ma'am, with all respect, one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing is because we want to make it more affordable for Americans to live. That is one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. Now, last week, I visited the southern border, and we decided to check in on what's going on there at the southern border. And of course, like I said earlier, you often hear about immigration enforcement as about crime and about drug trafficking, and that is a big part of it. I was at Eagle Pass, and I was talking to local border control down there, and they told me that in just a matter of weeks, their small part of the border had gone from 1,500 daily encounters to less than 30. And again, that's in a matter of weeks. That's just a simple matter of common sense border enforcement. That matters. Thank you. And let's talk about why it matters. I mentioned housing, but one of the things I heard down there, I was talking to the mayor in that community, and he said it's incredibly stressful on local resources. It's stressful on their local hospitals. It's stressful on their local schools to have this massive increase. And so while, look, I recognize there's a diversity of opinions here, clearly there is, I also think it's important to be honest about those disagreements, to acknowledge those disagreements, but to say that the reason why we care about border security is because we want your communities to be safer, we want them to be more affordable, we want there to be less drugs in our country, and we want your citizens to be able to live the American dream. It is the birthright of every single one of our citizens, and we're going to fight for it every single day.
You can see all of Vice President Vance's comments and Mayor Bowser's comments at cspan.org and C-SPAN Now. More now on the economy and the Trump administration tariffs. We mentioned the market numbers earlier. The Associated Press reporting this afternoon that the market is, quote, on track for a seventh swing of more than 1% up or down in the last 8 days, following a scary stretch dominated by Trump's on and off again tariffs. The AP goes on to say, quote, the worry is that the whipsaw moves on tariffs will either hurt the economy directly or create enough uncertainty to drive U.S. companies and consumers into an economy freezing paralysis. Well, here's what the president had to say about that on Fox News yesterday.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. We're bringing wealth back to America. That's a big thing. And there are always periods of, it takes a little time. It takes a little time. But I think it should be great for us. I mean, I think it should be great. It's going to be great ultimately for the farmer. You know, don't forget, I made the deal with China on the farmers where they had to buy $50 billion worth of product. $50 billion from 15 to 50.
Did they follow up and do it?
They did it when I was president. What happened is when Biden was president, they didn't buy any longer. Yeah, because there was nobody to call them. I used to call President Xi. I said, you got to do me a favor. You got to, live up to that agreement. And he was great. He did.
Before you came into the Oval Office the first time, you were a very successful businessman, very successful real estate executive. And a lot of people said, oh, this is the business president. This is it. He's watching the stock market. He knows all about, he doesn't want the market to go down. And now we've got tariffs and the market has been going down.
Well, not much. I mean, in all fairness, not much.
You said, look, we're going to have a disruption, but we're okay with that. Is that what you meant? The stock market going down was the disruption? What other disruption were you alluding to?
Look, what I have to do is build a strong country. You can't really watch the stock market. If you look at China, they have a 100-year perspective. We have a quarter. We go by quarters.
That's true.
And you can't go by that. You have to do what's right. What we're doing is we're building a tremendous foundation for the future. Tremendous foundation.
And here's Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on Meet the Press yesterday.
All right, Mr. Secretary, consumer sentiment is dropping. Inflation has ticked up. Major banks like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs now say a recession in the next 12 months is becoming more likely. Should Americans brace for a recession?
Absolutely not. Anybody who bets against Donald Trump, it's like the same people who thought Donald Trump wasn't a winner a year ago. Donald Trump is a winner. He's going to win for the American people. That's just the way it's going to be. There's going to be no recession in America. What there's going to be is global tariffs are going to come down because President Trump has said, you want to charge us 100%? We're going to charge you 100%. And you know what they say? They say, no, don't charge us 100%. We'll bring ours down. We'll unleash America out to the world, grow our economy in a way we've never grown before. You are going to see over the next 2 years the greatest set of growth coming from America as Americans. You saw it, 1.3 trillion of new investment coming in America. Think of all those jobs. And remember, each trillion of investment in America is 1% of growth GDP. So Donald Trump is bringing growth to America. I would never bet on recession. No chance.
Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick yesterday on NBC News Meet the Press. You're listening to Washington Today.
When presidents come into office, traditionally their first big speech to Congress is about the budget, like President Trump this past week. Instead of a State of the Union address, new presidents share their economic agenda and vision for the coming 4 years. And almost always in that big budget speech, they anguish over the escalating national debt, like President Ronald Reagan in 1981.
Our national debt is approaching $1 trillion. A few weeks ago, I called such a figure, $1 trillion, incomprehensible. And I've been trying ever since to think of a way to illustrate how big $1 trillion really is. And the best I could come up with is that if you had a stack of $1,000 bills in your hand, only 4 inches high, you'd be a millionaire. $1 trillion would be a stack of $1,000 bills 67 miles high.
And President Bill Clinton in 1993.
I well remember 12 years ago, President Reagan stood at this very podium and told you and the American people that if our national debt were stacked in $1,000 bills, the stack would reach 67 miles into space. Well, today, that stack would reach 267 miles.
What have other new presidents said in their economic speeches to Congress about the debt? Which presidents have blamed other presidents? And how has rhetoric about the debt changed over past decades in these speeches to Congress? Find out in the latest episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly, as we hear new presidents fret about the debt. Find C-SPAN's The Weekly wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a challenge to a Colorado law that bans so-called conversion therapy on young people. Conversion therapy is a controversial practice aimed at young people who are questioning their sexual orientation or gender identity. According to SCOTUS blog, the decision is notable because the court has previously declined to take up conversion therapy bans. And reporting on the case background, CBSNews.com writes that the case's plaintiff is Kaylee Childs, a Christian counselor who says the law violates her free speech rights. Colorado enacted the law back in 2019 following what the state said was a growing mental health crisis among young people, along with, quote, mounting evidence that conversion therapy is tied to increased depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. 29 states have laws that either fully or partially ban the practice. That's according to the Movement Advancement Project. The court will hear the case in its new term, which begins in October. Now to Canada's incoming Prime Minister, Mark Carney. He is the former leader of Canada's central bank. He won more than 85% of the vote by Liberal Party members at a convention in Ottawa yesterday. Former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland finished a distant second, and CBC.ca reporting that Mark Carney's first days in office are, quote, bound to be defined by chaos. He takes over during ongoing negotiations with the United States to lift tariffs on goods. U.S. President Donald Trump has cast uncertainty over the Canadian economy as he enacts and then walks back steep tariffs on some Canadian goods. In his victory speech, the Prime Minister-elect promised the government will keep up the fight against the Trump tariffs.
There's someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed. And we won't. We won't. I am proud of the response of Canadians who are making their voices heard and their wallets felt. I am grateful for how our provinces are stepping up to the fight, because when we are united, we are Canada strong. The Canadian government has rightly retaliated and is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs that will have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. And my government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect. And until they can join us in making credible and reliable commitments to free and fair trade. As Chrystia did. Yeah. And in the meantime, we will ensure that all the proceeds from our tariffs will be used to protect our workers.
Reuters White House correspondent Nandita Bose said on this morning's Washington Journal that she expects Mark Carney and President Trump to speak soon.
I absolutely expect him to have a conversation with Mark Carney. I think Mark Carney is already out on X, making his thoughts and his positions clear on tariffs, and that is Canada is going to respond to the U.S. the same way as the United States has with reciprocal tariffs, with other tariffs, on cars and on other items. I think on the tariff issue, it's obviously very tricky. The president has constantly gone back and forth with how he wants to impose tariffs, and that whiplash, imposing tariffs one day, then offering an industry reprieve the second day, and he's done it so many times that's almost confusing what is in place and what isn't. And so businesses don't really have a lot of clarity, and the administration is asking for more clarity from President Trump, and I know the Canadians will be asking for that as well because of the confusion that has ensued since the president has been going back and forth on this issue.
Earlier today, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said he would move forward with a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to 3 U.S. states starting today. According to CNN, the surcharge will affect electricity sales for 1.5 million homes across Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, and could cost up to $400,000 per day. Now, no date has been set yet for Mark Carney to take office. He takes over for Justin Trudeau, who announced back in January he would step down. You can see all of Mark Carney's speech at cspan.org and C-SPAN Now. A new effort to replace Andrew Jackson with abolitionist Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill is moving forward today. New Hampshire Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen is introducing a bill to put Harriet Tubman's face on all $20 bills printed after December 31st, 2030. The move today follows a decade-long effort of previous attempts. Senator Shaheen told NPR that Harriet Tubman is, quote, nothing short of an American icon, a true patriot who sacrificed so much for the betterment of our nation. Senator Shaheen's bill comes following the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Hundreds of people honored the day with a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama yesterday to remember the day in 1965 when civil rights activists marched across the bridge and then were brutally beaten and tear-gassed by Alabama state troopers. The event helped spur President Lyndon Johnson's support for what eventually became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. From the C-SPAN video library, here's former Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach talking about the events of Bloody Sunday with President Johnson.
Did we take every precaution we could have or should have? I think so, Mr. President. We had a large number there. Yesterday morning, I heard they were going to use tear gas. We told the Negro leaders that. I spoke to Senator Hill whether anything could be done. He could think of anything to be done with Governor Wallace and state troopers. He said he couldn't think of much. He did help me yesterday morning. Wilson Baker, who's been the Commissioner of Public Safety there at Selma, was going to resign in disgust because the mayor had interfered with his making some arrests of some white rowdies the day before, and the senator was helpful. The senator, among others, was helpful in making him change his mind, which that would have been serious. Had that been done, we had a large number of agents there. I had lawyers there on the scene, and I don't know there's much else the federal government can do in those circumstances. Short of taking the situation over, and here I'm here.
You can hear more White House conversations about Bloody Sunday and the Civil Rights Movement in our podcast series, Presidential Recordings. You can find Presidential Recordings wherever you get your podcasts. It's also on cspan.org and our free C-SPAN Now mobile app. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. You can also find it on YouTube. Just search Washington Today. And for more on the stories that are shaping Washington every day, get our daily email word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum inviting you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy from Washington, D.C. to across the country. And coming up Tuesday morning, Notice politics reporter Reese Gorman talks about Tuesday's planned vote on a House Republican measure to fund the government through September 30th. And then Emily G. from the Center for American Progress and the Cato Institute's Romina Baccia on federal spending and the Trump administration's economic agenda. Also, Rebecca Pincus, Polar Institute Director at the Wilson Center, will discuss President Trump's interest in obtaining Greenland. C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Join in the conversation live at 7 a.m. Eastern Tuesday on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app, or online at cspan.org.